The movie opens with a man with shaggy brown hair and dark eyes walking into a bookstore. He looks lost and sad as he observes the people around him going through life, while he has no idea what to do with his. The man's name is Carlos. He is a methodic scriptwriter who likes his things organized in a certain way and whose life is crumbling because his wife of 8 years is asking for a break. He doesn't know what to do now that his marriage is failing. He goes to the bookstore because it's a cozy place where he can go and maybe forget his miserable life for a moment. After walking in, he orders 3 shots of an alcoholic drink that he has never had before and sits down to relax. Meanwhile, a pixie-like girl with golden blonde hair and big, blue eyes stares at him from across the room. She notices him drinking brandy in a shot glass instead of a tall glass, and that little detail catches her attention. Carlos is more charming than handsome, and he doesn't have any specific feature that makes him stand out. The only reason he fascinates her is the way he is drinking, enjoying every little sip he takes of his drink. In turn, Carlos notices the pretty girl staring at him with a book open on her lap and starts feeling self-conscious. Her striking blue eyes seem to be looking into his soul, and it's disconcerting. He wonders if they know each other, though he doesn't recognize her. It's hard to believe she would be interested in him because, contrary to him, she is the type of person who stands out in a crowd. Her name's Irene. She's an eccentric girl who likes to experience her life to the fullest, and who is also having issues in her marriage. When she sees Carlos looking sad and lost, she thinks it will be a good idea to approach him and make him an offer that will blow his mind. With no hesitation, she sits down at his table. Carlos looks even more confused by the stranger's actions. She's a pretty girl, though, and he feels lonely, so he doesn't say anything about her sitting with him. Irene informs him that she would like to get to know him, though not with their real names. She explains that she wants to come up with a name that only she can use with him, and he has to do the same to her. She doesn't want to get to know him as he portrays himself. She wants to know without societal expectations. It enchants her the way children at parks play with each other without the need to know who they are or what they do in life. They just play. When she saw Carlos, she thought he would be a great playmate, so she proposes that they play together. The only rules are that Carlos doesn't search for Irene. He has to be open and answer her questions, no matter if he lies, and he can't fall in love with her. It seems simple enough, so Carlos accepts her proposal. They schedule a meeting for the following week, without using cell phones to communicate. Irene leaves him with a big smile on her face and a promise that they are going to have a lot of fun. As for Carlos, he is fascinated by the girl and excited about the prospect of meeting her again. After leaving the bookstore, Carlos meets with his friend and co-worker, Cristobal, a strange man that helps Carlos write his scripts. They are in the middle of a new story when Carlos confesses to doing what Cristobal told him not to. He confesses to following Maria and discovering that she's cheating on him with another man. Then, he tells him that on that same day, he met a girl at the bookstore. Cristobal is surprised because Carlos had been hung up on his wife, Maria, for a long time. He doesn't think it's a good idea for Carlos to go out with other women because his situation with Maria is complicated. It's not that she doesn't love Carlos anymore, she just feels confused and depressed about life in general. That's why she asked for a break, to figure out what she wanted. Cristobal knows that Carlos loves Maria despite her asking for a break, and putting another woman in the mix doesn't seem like a good idea. Carlos is already too into Irene to pull back, and Cristobal notices it. They call Irene a manic pixie dream girl, a quirky kind of girl who has an eccentric personality, and is very girlish. This type is best known to fall for the broody and depressed hero, which matches Carlos' personality. Cristobal thinks he may try to sleep with her to try to lighten up, but Carlos still worries about Maria, and if it would be considered a betrayal to her. A week goes by and the day of their meeting finally arrives. Carlos arrives first and waits for 30 minutes for Irene. When she apologizes for the delay, Carlos jokes that he likes to wait because it gives him time to think about stupid things. They are in a coffee shop and Irene decides to order a brandy from a glass, like Carlos, to be daring. Carlos admits that he was waiting expectantly for the day of their meeting to arrive, and that she is the dream of any bored man like himself. Irene wonders if he is bored with life, and Carlos says that he's only saying what she wants to hear. For him, girls like her like to redeem men like him, and help him overcome his issues and trauma to become a better man. His monologue about how women have a maternal instinct to take care of men with issues doesn't impress Irene. She goes to the restroom after his speech and Carlos berates himself for his big mouth. He was trying to sound interesting and alluring but ended up looking self-asserting and arrogant. After Irene comes back, they go walking around the museum to see the exhibition. Irene tells him that it feels like their first date is their third and that it isn't superficial enough for her. Carlos apologizes for his long speech about women unconsciously pitying men. They start over with a lighter approach from Carlos lying about who he is and pretending to be an alien from another planet sent to Earth to eliminate a threat. Irene enjoys his storyline better and they start making up stories about each other. Carlos tells her about her manic pixie dream girl persona that he thinks is fake. In reality, he thinks that she recently had her heart broken and left by her significant other, which made her feel as if she had been torn apart. Irene is astonished that he knows so much about her and could figure her out so quickly. The happy-go-lucky mask she built for herself to cope with her loss and sadness was torn apart from her by an observant Carlos. She wonders if he reads minds on his planet, and he confesses that he had seen her days before they met, in the same bookstore, crying her eyes out for a man. Irene had no idea that he already knew her, even from afar, and calls him a cheat for not saying anything before and leading her on. It's not what she wanted when she proposed to play with him. She wanted to forget her sadness and misery and thought it would be a good idea to pretend that she isn't the girl who was left by the man she loved. That is taken away from her by Carlos, and Irene isn't happy about it at all. She leaves him after he asks if they can continue playing. Carlos knows he messed up, and this time he may never see her again. Carlos isn't the only one feeling lonely and desperate for companionship. Irene abruptly changes her mind and comes back to him, and they continue their game even after breaking one rule, to not get to know each other for real. Carlos asks if Irene still loves the man who broke her heart, and she replies that she can't help it. The man, Jorge, is a poet, and that is enough to catch Irene's attention. She really loves him, but Jorge is the type of person who makes people fall for him, and then he leaves. She isn't his first victim, and she certainly won't be the last. Still, Irene holds to the hope that Jorge could miraculously change for her, something that Carlos thinks is ridiculous. She may be the manic pixie dream girl after all, though her brooding and depressed hero isn't Carlos, but Jorge. At the same time, he can't judge her too harshly because he's still hung up on his wife. He tells her that he understands why she still loves the man because relationships aren't one-dimensional. There are bad moments, but there are good moments too. The hope that both Irene and Carlos are holding onto comes from the good memories they have with their significant others. They continue talking about their failed relationships for a long time. Irene even admits that the day before he broke up with her, Jorge made a romantic dinner for her and professed his undying love for her. It leaves her confused as to what to feel for him because even though he broke her heart, he still loved her. In Carlos' opinion, Jorge thinks he deserves better than Irene, and that's why he broke up with her out of the blue. Subconsciously, Carlos is talking about himself and Maria. That's the reason he thinks she suddenly decided to break their marriage because there weren't any apparent signs for him. Irene wonders if now that he knows who she is and that she isn't the male fantasy stereotype, he is disappointed with her. He replies that the thing he likes most about women is their flaws. Irene is surprised and jokes that he may be the manic pixie dream boy, the ultimate female fantasy man, and he smoothly answers that she could find out if he is. Irene is swayed by his subtle flirting and charms. She might have broken her own rule of not falling for him if Jorge didn't exist. Before they leave for the night, she informs him that he will be the next to answer uncomfortable questions, and they schedule to meet the next day. Carlos is smitten with Irene, and as he mentioned, her flaws are even more appealing to him. He can connect with her in a way that he hasn't connected with someone in years, and he feels a kinship with her because of their similar situations. What Carlos doesn't know is that Irene is living a hard life. She's broke and has to work in a job she hates at a bakery. After her date with Carlos, Jorge calls her while she's working and she argues with him in the middle of her work. He wants her to meet him in the place where they met for the first time because he misses her. Irene gets angry and remembers what Carlos said about Jorge, thinking he deserves better than her. She starts calling him bad names and ends the conversation by saying that she's seeing someone else. Talking to him again, after all he put her through for being a selfish man, makes Irene lose her mind. She cries as she thinks about all the bad things Jorge made her feel, the other women he dated while with her, and how much he hurts her. Worst of all is the fact that she still loves him. She hates that she can't stop loving him despite him not loving her enough to respect her. She screams in anger and pain, throwing bread on the floor and crying. After her outburst, she quits her job and stomps out. While she cries about Jorge and how stupid she feels about loving him, she pretends Carlos is there with her and asks him if he's married. That's a very important question for a person who just had her heart broken and doesn't want to repeat. It's the first thing she needs to ask Carlos, and if he says he is, they have to go their separate ways. She's already seeing him as a way to forget Jorge and move on. It would be devastating if he was married. The following day, Carlos meets Cristobal again. He tells his friend about their date and Cristobal wonders why Irene didn't ask Carlos if he's married. He thinks that she may not care about it or she's not looking to have a relationship with him. Carlos insists that he won't sleep with her, but Cristobal thinks he's a joke for thinking that. Of course, he wants to sleep with her, but that doesn't mean Irene wants the same from him. According to Cristobal, women can see men they like as friends only and not as possible bed partners. Men, on the other hand, can't see women as friends. If they like a woman, they want to sleep with her. Carlos is confused about his feelings regarding Irene. He likes her and thinks she's pretty and interesting. Yet he doesn't know if he's ready for another relationship. And Irene is very different from his first impression of her. She's broken, like him, and lonely. That isn't a good foundation for a relationship because they might see themselves as support instead of partners. At their meeting, as soon as she arrives, Irene surprisingly runs to Carlos and kisses his face. She's happier than the day Jorge called her and she informs him that she owes Carlos for his advice. It gave her strength to deny Jorge when he asked her to come back to him. Carlos is relieved she didn't accept Jorge back. If she did, Cristobal would have been right that she only wants him to listen to her and to give her advice. It's time for Irene to ask her uncomfortable questions. The first is if he's married, and to her surprise, he confirms it. Carlos isn't comfortable telling her the whole truth about his marriage, so he pretends to get a call from Cristobal and walks away from her. Irene notices he's stalling and goes after him to pester him about the answer. It's only fair he replies to her questions since she told him the story of her life on their last date. Carlos relents and explains that he has been married for 5 years and that he very much loves his wife. The issue isn't his lack of feelings, but hers. Maria asked him to move out of their house and he has been living with Cristobal for a month. When he asked her what happened, she told him that nothing had happened, which is worse than a proper answer. She just feels as if their relationship is stagnant, and that they didn't create anything important in their years as a couple, despite having a daughter. As he vents to Irene, it's possible to see that Carlos is more upset and hurt than he shows. He thinks that Maria isn't attracted to him anymore, and that's the only reason she decided to take a break from him and their marriage. He doesn't think he's part of the problem, or that he did something wrong. In his words, he followed all the steps for a happy and perfect relationship, and it still didn't work out. Irene suggests he gives her the time she's asking for and meanwhile, goes out with a younger girl to make her jealous. Carlos stares at her as if she's the one he wants to use to make Maria jealous, but Irene doesn't suspect anything. It's obvious that Carlos' infatuation is only getting stronger and that he wants to date Irene. He even tells her of a dream he had with her the night before that they were in a park, alone, when 2 singers started playing a love song to them. What he doesn't mention is that they also kiss passionately in the dream, a projection of what Carlos wants to do in real life. They get to know each other even more deeply after Carlos tells her about Maria. They are 10 years apart in age, and Carlos has written a famous movie that Irene has already seen. He isn't happy about his job anymore. He wants to write something deeper and more meaningful than trash comedy, and he has had a play in the works for 3 years that has yet to be published. Irene comforts him and tells him that it will work out. It relieves Carlos to hear that from her because he had been feeling like a failure. Maria doesn't listen to him as Irene does, so he has kept his insecurities regarding his work to himself. It feels good to tell someone else, though. He feels seen and understood. Irene is a breath of fresh air. She's in a phase of her life where she has to decide what she wants to do in her future, and the only thing she wants is to keep dreaming and be happy. It's a simple way to look at life and one that Carlos thinks is refreshing. She doesn't overthink anything, just goes with the flow and tries to do her best. With her, he feels like a young man, not a frustrated writer with a broken marriage. She also doesn't deserve the way she's treated by Jorge, so Carlos decides to confess a secret he has kept under lock and key. The day he saw Irene for the first time, he decided to follow his wife's lover to try and understand what she saw in him that Carlos didn't have. The man he was following entered a bookstore and sat down with a pretty blonde-haired girl. It was Irene, and Maria's lover is Jorge. Irene is stupefied. She can't believe that they both had been made fools by the same people. What is worse, Carlos didn't tell her right away. He pretended he didn't know her when he knew this whole time that Jorge was playing her with his wife. Carlos explains that he wanted to have a beautiful beginning to their story, not one where they were the betrayed partners of 2 selfish people. Instead of staying mad at him for his manipulation, Irene and Carlos go back to talking. This time, about the people they love. Irene tells Carlos that Jorge is a man-child who very often forgets to be an adult. Carlos tells Irene that Maria is the kind of woman that makes him feel like he's a god just by looking at him. The issue is that she doesn't look at him anymore. Carlos confesses that he called her 2 weeks before and told her that he knew there was someone else. Maria called him paranoid and hung up on his face. Except she didn't hang up and he heard her with Jorge, getting intimate. He was paralyzed and shocked that Maria seemed like a completely different person. He was humiliated and ashamed. Maria never acted the way she was with Jorge with him. Carlos never asked for something different because he was afraid she would think he was a pervert. Irene tells him that he should have said something to Maria. Maybe if he did, Maria would have been satisfied with their marriage. Carlos is too bashful to say or do heated things in bed, so Irene tries to help him. She asks him to talk to her like one of his favorite writers would. Carlos overcomes his shyness and acts like his favorite writer, saying lecherous things to Irene. She likes it so much that when he ends his act, she grabs his face and kisses him like there's no tomorrow. They decide to start dating for real after their kiss and confessions. They go to the bookstore where they met and make a toast for their lovers, the ones they never had, and for each other. While they are kissing passionately in the middle of the bookstore, Jorge and Maria appear. They were also on a date. Maria isn't happy to see her husband making out with a younger girl. She questions him, despite her lover being right behind her. Carlos and her leave the restaurant so they can talk in private. Carlos explains that Irene is the girl Jorge left to be with Maria. She gets mad at him when he points out her cheating on him again. He calls her a cynic and starts laughing. Meanwhile, Jorge and Irene are also talking. Jorge accuses her of bringing Carlos to their favorite restaurant, and she snaps that he brought him there when he started sleeping with his wife. Jorge, with his soft voice and poetic words, tells her that what she said is a bitter metaphor. Irene is already mad at him for not only betraying and breaking up with her, but for doing it with Carlos' wife. She snidely replies that it isn't a metaphor because Carlos caught them together in that same bookstore. Maria refuses to admit that she has an affair with Jorge, but Carlos has had enough of her cynicism and lies. He tells her that he heard she and Jorge being intimate when he called her, and still she denies it. Annoyed by her stubbornness, Carlos shows her the audio he recorded of her and Jorge. Maria finally realizes her situation and tries to grab Carlos' cell phone from him. Irene and Jorge are also having their standoff. Jorge denies that he had any involvement in the ending of Maria's relationship, and Irene calls him out saying that he pretends to be smart, but he isn't. Jorge asks what kind of relationship she has with Carlos, and she only replies by saying that she's fine and he doesn't have to worry about her. The way she smiles and tells him makes Jorge realize that he lost Irene for good this time. She doesn't need him anymore. Now she knows what it's like to be with someone who cares for her and listens to her. Jorge needs someone who can put him in his place, and it's not Irene. Carlos comes to the same conclusion regarding Maria. She finally explains to him what happened to her and why she decided to take a break from him. The day she met Jorge, she realized that she didn't feel alive. Her life was meaningless and uneventful. She loved Carlos, but she wasn't in love with him anymore. Seeing him with Irene made her feelings resurface. She wants to try again with him and asks for a second chance. Irene is cheering for the couple because they have a long story together and a daughter. She thinks he will want to go give his marriage another chance and forgive Maria for her mistakes. It's not far-fetched. She forgave Jorge for the same before. Irene likes Carlos, and maybe they could have a good relationship, but he has to be the one to decide. In the end, Carlos decides to give Maria another chance, but not without pain, because he was falling for Irene and her manic pixie dream girl attitude. They part ways with the promise to see each other in their dreams, but not in real life. Carlos goes back to Cristobal's house to grab his things and to tell his friend the latest updates about his love life. He tells Cristobal that before leaving, Irene said goodbye to Maria and gave him a list of her 10 favorite books. Carlos bought all of them to remember Irene and what she meant to him in the brief time they spent together. To be honest, Carlos is upset with the way things ended. He wanted to have more time with Irene to see where that would lead them. In his mind, they would have been very happy together. Cristobal, seeing his friend at war with himself and his choice, decides to admit that he slept with Maria too. He tells Carlos that Maria seduced him at his home, with his daughter sleeping in the bedroom. Carlos can't believe she has betrayed him more than once and with his best friend, no less. That's the last straw for him. He was questioning his decision before, but knowing that Maria cheated on him more than once was too much. After punching Cristobal, Carlos goes to the bookstore to meet with Irene without her knowing. He has been going there for a week, and it was only on that day that she finally appeared. Carlos tells Irene that he finally has the inspiration to write his play after 3 years, and it's all because of her. He could have forgotten about her and continued his marriage with Maria, despite knowing that she would probably cheat on him again. Instead, he decided to listen more to his heart instead of his brain. He wants to be with Irene. He's in love with her. Irene jokingly says she's back with Jorge, and Carlos almost has a conniption until she starts laughing. Carlos informs her that he's not back with Maria and that he finally understands that their story has reached an end. No matter how many times he tried to write another chapter, it would always be a bad one. His story with Irene is just at the beginning, and he wants to see how it develops. Maybe it will finish with a happy ending.